Welcome, dear listener, to another peaceful journey through history's quieter corridors. As evening settles around you and the world grows still, let us travel together to 16th century France, where we shall meet a woman whose story changed the course of a kingdom. Take a deep breath, settle into your comfortable space, and let the gentle rhythm of this tale carry you toward restful sleep. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of Tuscany in the year 1519. In the great city of Florence, where marble statues gleamed in the Mediterranean sun and merchant princes built palaces that touched the clouds, a child was born who would one day hold the fate of France in her hands. Her name was Isabella de Medici, and though she entered the world as an orphan, destiny had remarkable plans for this merchant's daughter. The Medici family had built their fortune not through noble blood, but through careful counting of coins and shrewd understanding of trade. They were bankers, these Medici, whose vaults held the wealth of kingdoms, but whose names did not appear in the ancient books of European nobility. When Isabella's parents departed this world within mere weeks of her birth, leaving her in the care of relatives who saw her primarily as a valuable piece to be moved across the chessboard of European politics, few could have imagined that this orphan child would one day reshape the very foundations of French civilization. Isabella's childhood passed quietly in the marble halls of Medici palaces, where she learned the arts appropriate to a merchant's daughter. She studied letters and numbers, music and dance, but always with the understanding that her true purpose lay not in scholarship, but in marriage. The Medici family had ambitious plans for their young relative, plans that would carry her far from the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany to the gray stone castles of northern France. When Isabella had seen barely 14 summers, her relatives informed her that she would journey to France to marry Prince Henry, the second son of King Francis I. This was not a romantic tale of young love blossoming across borders, but a careful business arrangement designed to strengthen the alliance between the French crown and the Medici banking empire. Isabella would bring with her a dowry so magnificent it could fund entire armies. But what she could not bring was the one thing that mattered most in royal circles, the respect that came with noble blood. The journey from Florence to France took many weeks, winding through mountain passes and across rivers, through forests where morning mist clung to ancient trees and past villages where common folk paused in their daily labors to watch the grand procession pass. Isabella traveled in a magnificent carriage painted with the Medici arms, surrounded by guards and servants, carrying chests filled with golden coins and precious gems. Yet for all this outward splendor, she was essentially cargo being shipped from one family to another, a young woman whose future would be determined by men she had never met. The French court that welcomed Isabella was unlike anything she had experienced in Florence, where the Medici palaces had been filled with the practical energy of commerce and trade. The French court moved to the rhythm of ancient ceremony and rigid hierarchy. Nobles who traced their lineages back to Charlemagne looked down upon this Italian merchant's daughter with poorly concealed disdain. They whispered behind gloved hands about her foreign accent, her unfamiliar customs, and most cruelly of all, her family's humble origins in trade rather than warfare. Prince Henry, Isabella's betrothed, was a pleasant enough young man, but their marriage was conducted with all the warmth of a business transaction. The wedding ceremonies lasted for days, filled with magnificent pageantry designed to celebrate the alliance between France and the Medici banking interests. Isabella wore gowns of silk and velvet, her hair adorned with pearls and precious stones. But beneath all this finery was a frightened girl far from home, bound to a man in a kingdom that viewed her as an unwelcome necessity. The early years of Isabella's marriage were marked by a humiliation that would shape every decision of her later life. Despite the expectations placed upon her, despite the prayers offered in countless chapels throughout France, Isabella remained childless year after year. In a world where royal wives were valued primarily for their ability to produce heirs, Isabella's failure to conceive became the subject of endless court gossip and political speculation. French nobles began to whisper that perhaps the marriage should be dissolved, that Prince Henry should be freed to marry someone who could fulfill a royal wife's most basic duty. Isabella heard these whispers echoing through the corridors of the palace, saw the looks of pity and contempt from courtiers who had never accepted her, felt the growing distance from a husband who needed sons to secure his political future. The pain of these years, the constant awareness that her position hung by the thinnest of threads, began to transform the frightened Italian girl into something altogether more dangerous. During these difficult years, Isabella began to study subjects that were unusual for royal ladies. While other women of the court occupied themselves with embroidery and music, Isabella delved into books of natural philosophy and alchemical texts. She surrounded herself with learned men from Italy, scholars who understood the properties of herbs and minerals, the movements of stars and planets, the subtle arts that bordered on magic. Court observers noted that Isabella spent long hours in private consultation with these mysterious advisors, learning secrets that would prove invaluable in the years to come. The transformation in Isabella's fortunes came gradually, then suddenly. After 10 years of marriage, she finally conceived and bore a son. Then came another child and another. Over the course of 13 years, Isabella would give birth to 10 children, securing her position as the mother of future kings and queens. The court that had once whispered about her barrenness now marveled at her fertility, though some wondered quietly whether her sudden ability to conceive had been aided by the mysterious studies she had pursued during her years of childlessness. By the year 1547, Isabella's husband had become King Henry II of France, making her queen consort. Yet even as queen, Isabella faced challenges that would have broken a lesser woman. King Henry was completely devoted to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years older than Isabella, who wielded more influence over the king than his own wife. Diane controlled royal policy, managed state finances, and lived openly at court while Isabella was relegated to the role of ceremonial wife and mother. The humiliation of watching another woman enjoy the power and affection that should have been hers burned within Isabella like a slow fire. She observed carefully, learning how influence was gained and maintained, how enemies could be neutralized, how patience and cunning could overcome even the most disadvantaged position. Isabella was learning the dark arts of political survival, skills that would serve her well in the trials to come. The turning point in Isabella's story came during a grand tournament held to celebrate the marriage of her eldest daughter. King Henry, eager to display his prowess before his beloved Diane, entered the lists against a younger opponent. The crowd watched in horror as the younger man's lance shattered against Henry's visor, driving splinters of wood deep into the king's brain. Henry lingered for 10 agonizing days before death finally claimed him, leaving Isabella in a position she had dreamed of for 20 years. The true power behind the French throne. With Henry's death, the crown passed to Isabella's eldest son, Francis. But at 15 years old, he was little more than a child. Isabella, as Queen Mother, would be the real ruler of France. For the first time in her life, she held genuine power, and she was determined never to lose it. The merchant's daughter who had been scorned and humiliated for 2 decades was about to demonstrate just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone who had spent years studying the arts of survival and revenge. Isabella's first challenge came from an unexpected source. Her daughter-in-law, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. Mary had married Isabella's son Francis and, as the new Queen of France, possessed both beauty and political cunning that threatened to overshadow Isabella entirely. Mary came from the powerful Guise family, French nobles who had their own ambitions for controlling the throne, and who viewed Isabella as an obstacle to their plans. The Guise family looked upon Isabella and saw what they had always seen: a foreign merchant's daughter who had no business ruling France. They began maneuvering to push Isabella aside and govern through their niece Mary and her young husband, King Francis. But they had seriously underestimated the woman they were dealing with. Isabella had spent decades learning patience, cunning, and most importantly, the art of eliminating obstacles without leaving obvious traces. Within months of Henry's death, mysterious ailments began to plague members of the Guise faction. Political opponents found themselves suffering from sudden, inexplicable illnesses that seemed to target anyone who dared challenge Isabella's authority. The whispers about the Shadow Queen began in earnest, but Isabella's most brilliant move was yet to come. In December of 1560, just 18 months after becoming king, Isabella's son Francis died suddenly of what physicians described as a severe ear infection. He was only 16 years old. With Francis dead, Mary Stuart was no longer Queen of France, and the crown passed to Isabella's second son, the 10-year-old Charles IX. Now Isabella was regent of France. The official ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe thought the transformation was complete. The merchant's daughter had finally claimed her throne, but ruling France in the 16th century was like trying to hold lightning in a bottle. The kingdom was tearing itself apart over religious differences, with Catholic and Protestant factions engaging in increasingly bitter conflicts. Isabella found herself caught between extremists, Catholics who wanted to eliminate all Protestants from France and growing Protestant communities who demanded equal rights and recognition. Rather than seeking compromise, Isabella quickly realized that these religious conflicts could be turned to her advantage. She began playing both sides against each other, supporting whichever faction served her immediate needs while ruthlessly eliminating anyone who threatened her control. She would promise tolerance to the Protestants when she needed their support, then authorize severe restrictions when the Catholics demanded action. This was not inconsistency, but calculated manipulation on a scale that would have impressed ancient philosophers of statecraft. Isabella understood that as long as Catholics and Protestants were fighting each other, neither faction would be strong enough to challenge her authority. She was deliberately keeping France in a state of controlled chaos because chaos served her purposes perfectly. Isabella's network of informants grew during these years into something resembling a modern intelligence service. She maintained spies in every major household, agents who reported on private conversations and secret meetings. Nothing happened in France without Isabella knowing about it, and more importantly, nothing happened without her permission. She had created what some historians would later call her flying squadron, a group of intelligent, beautiful noble women who served as her personal operatives. These were not mere court ladies gossiping over needlework. They were trained agents who could gather information from foreign ambassadors, manipulate rival nobles, and when necessary, ensure that particularly troublesome individuals experienced unfortunate accidents. The most skilled member of this squadron was Charlotte de Beaune, a striking woman who specialized in seducing Protestant leaders, gathering intelligence on their plans, and occasionally ensuring that certain conversations remained permanently private. Meanwhile, Isabella's son Charles was growing up under his mother's careful guidance, learning lessons that would have horrified any normal parent. Isabella was not simply teaching him statecraft. She was instructing him in the arts of manipulation and elimination. Charles watched his mother orchestrate the mysterious deaths of political rivals, observed how she could smile warmly at someone during dinner, and have them removed from the political equation by morning. By the early 1570s, France had descended into what historians would call the wars of religion, conflicts that would consume the country for decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. At the center of it all was Isabella, pulling strings, making deals, and removing anyone who stood in her way. The woman who had once been dismissed as a powerless foreigner had transformed herself into one of the most feared rulers in European history The Protestant movement in France was led by Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a man who represented everything Isabella feared most. Coligny was brilliant, honorable, and completely incorruptible. He could not be bought, seduced, or intimidated. Worse still, he was gaining influence over Isabella's son, King Charles, offering the young king a vision of France that did not require his mother's constant manipulation and control. Isabella watched in growing alarm as Charles began spending more time with Coligny, seeking his advice on matters of state and even religious questions. The admiral was offering Charles something Isabella never could: the possibility of being a truly independent ruler rather than a puppet dancing to his mother's designs. This was Isabella's greatest fear, that her carefully constructed system of control might be dismantled by someone appealing directly to her son's conscience. Something had to be done about Admiral Coligny, but Isabella knew that simply eliminating the Protestant leader would create complications. She needed something more sophisticated, more final, more devastating. Isabella began developing what would become one of the most elaborate political traps in European history. She would invite the Protestant leadership to Paris for a grand celebration, make them feel safe and welcome. Then, eliminate them all in one coordinated action. The perfect opportunity came in 1572, when Isabella arranged the marriage of her daughter Margaret to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince. This wedding was presented as a symbol of religious reconciliation, a grand gesture showing that Catholics and Protestants could indeed live together in harmony. Thousands of French Protestants traveled to Paris for the celebration, including Admiral Coligny and virtually every other major Protestant leader in France. They came believing they were attending a joyous occasion that would mark the beginning of a new era of religious tolerance. They had no idea they were walking into the most sophisticated elimination scheme ever conceived. Isabella spent months planning every detail of what was to come. She coordinated with Catholic militants in Paris, ensuring that weapons would be distributed and targets identified. She arranged for the city gates to be secured so that no one could escape once the operation began. The wedding of Margaret and Henry took place on August 18, 1572, and by all accounts, it was a magnificent affair. The Protestant guests were treated with elaborate courtesy and hospitality. Isabella herself played the role of the gracious hostess, welcoming the Protestant leaders as honored guests and speaking warmly about the bright future of religious cooperation in France. For several days, the city of Paris seemed to embody the spirit of reconciliation that the royal wedding was supposed to represent. But beneath this facade of harmony, Isabella's agents were making final preparations for what was to come. On August 22nd, just 4 days after the wedding, Isabella made her first move. As Admiral Coligny was walking through the streets of Paris, a shot rang out from a window above, wounding him severely but not fatally. The failed elimination actually served Isabella's larger plan. She immediately rushed to Coligny's bedside, playing the role of the concerned queen mother and expressing outrage that anyone would dare attack a guest at her daughter's wedding. She promised a thorough investigation and vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice. But privately, Isabella was using the incident to convince her son that the Protestants were planning something desperate in response. On the night of August 23rd, Isabella finally revealed the full scope of her plan to her terrified son. It was not enough to eliminate Admiral Coligny alone. They had to remove the entire Protestant leadership while they were trapped in Paris. It was the only way to prevent religious war, she claimed. It was the only way to protect the throne. King Charles, driven to the edge of breakdown by his mother's relentless psychological pressure, finally gave the authorization Isabella had been waiting decades to receive. What happened next would forever stain Isabella's legacy and establish her reputation as one of history's most ruthless rulers. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on August 24th, 1572. Church bells throughout Paris began to toll. This was not a call to prayer, but the signal Isabella had arranged to begin the systematic elimination of every Protestant in the Vaudestas city. The first target was Admiral Coligny himself. Armed men burst into the house where the wounded Protestant leader was recovering and threw him from a second-story window onto the cobblestones below, where a crowd was waiting to complete the work. But Coligny's death was just the beginning. Throughout Paris, Catholic militants, armed with lists provided by Isabella's agents, began systematically hunting down Protestant families. The operation was not random or spontaneous. This was Isabella's carefully orchestrated plan playing out exactly as she had designed it. Protestant merchants were eliminated in their shops. Protestant nobles were removed in their lodgings. Protestant women and children were targeted alongside their husbands and fathers. The streets of Paris literally ran red as Isabella's elimination lists were methodically executed. What makes this event even more chilling is how Isabella maintained her facade of innocence throughout the entire ordeal. While thousands of her subjects were being eliminated just outside her palace walls, she continued playing the role of the shocked and dismayed Queen Mother. She sent messages to Protestant leaders in other cities, expressing her horror at the events and promising that the perpetrators would be punished. Meanwhile, her agents were secretly spreading word to Catholic strongholds throughout France that the Protestant leadership had been eliminated and that local Catholics should follow Paris's example. Isabella was not just orchestrating elimination in the capital. She was triggering a nationwide campaign that would claim tens of thousands of lives across France. The operation in Paris continued for 3 days. By the time it finally ended, an estimated 3,000 Protestants lay dead in the capital alone. Their bodies filled the Seine River, lined the streets, and created such devastation that residents had to burn incense just to manage the aftermath. Isabella de' Medici had achieved something that no European ruler had attempted before: the systematic elimination of an entire religious community in a matter of hours. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the event was not the scale of the operation, but Isabella's complete lack of remorse afterward. While Europe reacted with horror to news of what had happened in Paris, Isabella publicly celebrated the event as a great victory for Catholic France. She commissioned commemorative medals, ordered special church services, and even sent detailed accounts to foreign courts describing how successfully she had eliminated the Protestant threat. In the immediate aftermath, Isabella seemed to have achieved everything she had worked toward for decades. The Protestant movement in France was devastated. The Protestant political organization was destroyed. Most importantly, there was no longer any significant challenge to her control over the French throne. Foreign courts throughout Europe sent congratulations to Isabella for her decisive action. But Isabella had underestimated the long-term consequences of what she had unleashed. The event did not end religious conflicts in France. It made them exponentially worse. Protestant communities throughout Europe were horrified by what had happened in Paris, and they began providing military and financial support to surviving French Protestant communities. More importantly, Isabella had fundamentally changed the nature of religious conflict in France. Before the August events, religious conflicts had been primarily political disputes between competing noble factions. After 1572, they became existential struggles between communities that could no longer trust each other to coexist peacefully. Surviving Protestants in France realized that Isabella's promises of tolerance were worthless. They had seen what happened when they trusted her assurances of safety. Isabella had also created a psychological precedent that would haunt France for generations. She had demonstrated that religious differences could justify any level of violence, that political problems could be solved through systematic elimination, and that entire communities could be removed in the name of state security. But even as Isabella basked in the immediate political benefits, she was creating new problems that would ultimately destroy everything she had worked to build. Her son, King Charles, traumatized by his role in authorizing the elimination of thousands, began suffering from severe psychological problems. He experienced nightmares, violent outbursts, and periods of deep depression that made him increasingly unstable as a ruler. Charles had been raised by Isabella to be ruthless, but witnessing the actual consequences of that ruthlessness broke something fundamental in his mind. Meanwhile, the surviving Protestant leaders who had escaped were not simply accepting defeat and fading into obscurity. They were regrouping, rearming, and preparing for a war of revenge against Isabella and everything she represented. The Protestant strongholds in southern France became centers of resistance, where military commanders trained armies specifically designed to march on Paris and overthrow the regime that had tried to exterminate them. The irony of Isabella's situation would have been amusing if it were not so tragic. In trying to eliminate the Protestant threat through systematic violence, she had created a far more dangerous and implacable enemy than had ever existed before. The scattered religious dissidents of the 1560s had been transformed into a unified military force dedicated to destroying the woman who had tried to destroy them. But Isabella de Medici was not a woman who admitted mistakes or changed course when faced with the consequences of her actions. Rather than recognizing that the elimination campaign had been a strategic disaster, she doubled down on violence as the solution to her problems. If eliminating 3,000 Protestants had not solved the religious crisis, then she would simply have to eliminate more. Throughout the 1570s, Isabella continued authorizing military campaigns against Protestant strongholds. She funded Catholic armies that laid siege to Protestant cities, burning entire communities and executing prisoners without trial. She maintained her network of agents who targeted Protestant leaders throughout Europe. Each new operation only strengthened Protestant resolve and attracted more international support for the Protestant, because Catherine was trapped in a cycle of violence that she could not escape, because she refused to acknowledge that violence itself was the problem. The woman who had once been so skilled at political manipulation was now reduced to crude brutality as her primary tool of statecraft. The subtle intelligence networks, psychological campaigns, and sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering that had brought her to power were being abandoned in favor of increasingly desperate attempts to eliminate her way out of the crisis she had created. By the late 1570s, France was deteriorating rapidly. The kingdom that Isabella claimed to be protecting was destroying itself through endless religious wars. The economy was collapsing as Protestant merchants and craftsmen fled the country. Entire regions were depopulated by violence. The sophisticated Renaissance court that Isabella had inherited was degenerating into something resembling a medieval stronghold under siege. Yet Isabella remained convinced that she was the victim in this situation. In her correspondence with foreign rulers, she consistently portrayed herself as a long-suffering mother trying to hold her kingdom together against unreasonable Protestant extremists who refused to accept her generous offers of compromise. This capacity for self-deception was perhaps Isabella's most dangerous quality. She had convinced herself so thoroughly that her actions were justified, that she seemed genuinely unable to understand why anyone would object to systematic elimination in the name of political stability. King Charles, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly under the psychological pressure of being Isabella's primary accomplice in authorizing mass elimination. By 1574, he was experiencing what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from insomnia, violent nightmares, and episodes where he would speak about the spirits of victims haunting the palace. Charles began making increasingly erratic decisions that undermined Isabella's carefully constructed political strategies. He would contradict her orders, negotiate secretly with Protestant leaders, and publicly express regret for his role in the elimination campaign. Isabella watched in growing alarm as her perfectly controlled puppet ruler began developing an independent moral compass. The final blow to Isabella's relationship with Charles came when he began seriously considering converting to Protestantism, himself as a form of penance for the elimination campaign. The idea that her own son might join the religious movement she had tried to exterminate represented the ultimate failure of Isabella's political project. Charles died in May 1574 at the age of 23, officially from tuberculosis, but quite possibly from the psychological trauma of living with his mother's legacy. His final words were reportedly an apology to God for the August elimination campaign and a plea for forgiveness for the innocent lives lost. With Charles dead, the crown passed to Isabella's third son, Henry III, who was currently serving as King of Poland. Isabella immediately began making plans to recall Henry to France and resume her role as the power behind the throne. She was 54 years old, had already buried two of her sons, and was facing the most serious political crisis of her career. But giving up was simply not in Isabella de Medici's vocabulary. The woman who had transformed herself from a despised foreign bride into the most feared ruler in Europe was not about to let something as minor as a collapsing kingdom and a trail of destruction stop her from continuing to pursue power. Henry III's return to France in 1574 should have marked a fresh start for Isabella's political ambitions, but instead revealed just how completely her reign of terror had poisoned the very concept of royal authority. The new king arrived to find a kingdom that barely resembled the sophisticated Renaissance court his mother had inherited decades earlier. Paris itself had become a city haunted by its own recent history. The neighborhoods where Protestant families had been eliminated remained partially empty, their abandoned houses serving as grim reminders of what happened when people trusted Isabella's promises of safety. The same river, which had once carried the bodies of elimination victims, now seemed to flow with an undercurrent of fear that affected every aspect of daily life. But Isabella's most immediate problem was not the lingering trauma of the elimination campaign. It was the fact that her new puppet king had ideas of his own about how France should be governed. Henry III had spent 2 years ruling Poland, where he had learned to appreciate the concept of religious tolerance and political compromise. He returned to France with a shocking notion that would horrify his mother. Perhaps systematic elimination was not the best way to solve political problems. Henry's first major decision as king was to begin secret negotiations with surviving Protestant leaders about ending the religious wars that were devastating France. He met with Protestant representatives without Isabella's knowledge, offering genuine concessions and discussing the possibility of religious coexistence. For the first time in decades, it seemed like France might have a ruler who preferred diplomacy to elimination lists. Isabella was absolutely furious when she discovered what her son was doing. The woman who had spent her entire adult life believing that compromise was weakness could not comprehend why Henry would negotiate with people she considered enemies and heretics. She began the same psychological manipulation campaign that had worked so effectively on his brother Charles, painting vivid pictures of Protestant treachery and warning Henry that mercy would be interpreted as weakness by his enemies. But Henry III was not the traumatized young man his brother had been. He was 23 years old, had already ruled a kingdom successfully, and possessed a confidence that made him less susceptible to his mother's emotional manipulation. When Isabella demanded that he authorize new military campaigns against Protestant strongholds, Henry refused. When she insisted that captured Protestant leaders should be executed, Henry ordered them released. The perfect mother-son partnership that had orchestrated the August elimination campaign was falling apart. Isabella found herself in the bizarre position of having to fight her own son for control of the kingdom she had spent decades trying to secure. The woman who had eliminated every external threat to her power was now facing the ultimate internal challenge. A king who no longer trusted her judgment and was actively working to undo her life's work. The conflict between Isabella and Henry created a power vacuum that was immediately filled by the most dangerous political movement France had seen in generations. The Catholic League, led by Henry de Guise, represented everything Isabella had always feared about religious extremism, but from the opposite direction. These were not Protestant revolutionaries trying to overthrow the monarchy. These were Catholic fanatics who believed that Isabella and her sons were not Catholic enough. The League looked at Isabella's reign and saw a woman who had compromised with heretics, allowed Protestant communities to survive, and failed to complete the religious purification that the August elimination campaign had begun. They demanded not just the removal of Protestantism from France, but the replacement of the entire royal dynasty with rulers who would show proper Catholic zeal. Henry de Guise, whose family had been manipulated and used by Isabella for decades, now emerged as her most formidable opponent. He possessed everything that made a dangerous political rival: noble bloodline, military experience, religious credibility, and most importantly, genuine popular support among ordinary French Catholics who were exhausted by decades of religious warfare. Guise began holding massive rallies in Paris, where he condemned the royal monarchy as weak, corrupt, and insufficiently committed to Catholic principles. He reminded audiences that it was his family, not Isabella's, that had actually carried out the elimination during the August campaign. He suggested that France needed leaders who would finish what the campaign had started rather than the half-hearted policies of compromise that Henry III was pursuing. Isabella watched in growing alarm as her carefully constructed political system began collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously. Protestant armies were advancing from the south, demanding revenge for the elimination campaign and the overthrow of the regime that had authorized it. Catholic extremists were organizing in the north, demanding the removal of rulers they considered insufficiently zealous. The irony of Isabella's situation was almost poetic. The woman who had spent her entire career playing different factions against each other to maintain her own power was now watching those same factions unite in their hatred of her family. The divide-and-conquer strategy that had seemed so brilliant for decades was finally backfiring in the most spectacular way possible. But Isabella de Medici had not survived this long by accepting defeat gracefully. If her son would not authorize the kind of decisive action she believed was necessary, then she would simply have to take matters into her own hands. At nearly 60 years old, the Shadow Queen was about to demonstrate that she still possessed the ruthless cunning that had made her the most feared woman in Europe. Isabella's first target was Henry de Guise himself. She began developing an elimination plan that would remove the Catholic League's leadership while making it appear that Protestant extremists were responsible. The scheme involved luring Guise to a private meeting at the royal palace where Isabella's agents would eliminate him and then plant evidence suggesting that Protestant agents had infiltrated the court. But Isabella had underestimated how completely her reputation had preceded her. Guise was well aware of what had happened to previous political opponents who had accepted invitations to meet privately with the Queen Mother. He declined Isabella's invitation and began surrounding himself with bodyguards who were specifically trained to detect and counter the kind of subtle elimination techniques that Isabella had perfected over the decades. Frustrated by her inability to eliminate Guise directly, Isabella shifted to a strategy that was even more dangerous. She began secretly negotiating with foreign powers about intervening in French politics. Spain's Philip II had been watching the French religious wars with great interest, seeing them as an opportunity to expand Spanish influence and eliminate France as a rival European power. Isabella's correspondence with Spanish Agents during this period reveals just how completely her priorities had become, divorced from any concept of French national interests. She was willing to accept Spanish military intervention, Spanish political control over French policy, and even Spanish oversight of the French succession as long as these foreign allies would help her eliminate the Protestant movement and crush the Catholic League. The woman who had once been dismissed as a dangerous foreign influence in French politics was now actively inviting actual foreign domination as a solution to her domestic problems. Isabella had become so obsessed with maintaining power that she was prepared to destroy French independence rather than accept the possibility of losing control. Meanwhile, Henry III was desperately trying to hold his kingdom together through increasingly frantic attempts at political compromise. He offered concessions to Protestant leaders, then immediately contradicted those offers when Catholic extremists threatened rebellion. He promised religious tolerance in public speeches, then authorized military campaigns against Protestant strongholds when political pressure became unbearable. The young king, who had returned from Poland with such confidence, was being ground down by the impossible task of governing a kingdom that his mother had deliberately polarized, beyond any hope of reconciliation. Every decision Henry made satisfied no one while enraging everyone, and he began showing signs of the same psychological stress that had destroyed his brother Charles. Henry started experiencing panic attacks during public ceremonies, violent outbursts when discussing religious policy, and periods of deep depression where he would lock himself in his chambers for days at a time. The court physicians, who had learned to be very careful about what they said regarding royal mental health, began quietly discussing whether the king was having what we would today recognize as a complete nervous breakdown. Isabella watched her son's deterioration with a mixture of concern and opportunity. On one hand, Henry's psychological problems were making it impossible for him to provide the strong leadership that France desperately needed. On the other hand, his increasing instability created openings for Isabella to reassert her control over royal policy. She began positioning herself as the stable, experienced voice of reason who could guide the kingdom through its current crisis. Isabella started appearing at more public events, taking a more prominent role in diplomatic negotiations, and making speeches about the need for decisive action against France's enemies. The message was clear. If Henry III could not handle the responsibilities of kingship, his mother was prepared to step in and provide the leadership that the situation demanded. But Isabella's attempts to present herself as a stabilizing influence were undermined by the growing awareness among French nobles that she was the primary cause of the crisis in the first place. The August elimination campaign had not occurred in some distant historical period. It was barely a decade in the past, and many of the people now dealing with its consequences had been present when Isabella orchestrated the operations. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments that Isabella de Medici had become a figure of almost universal hatred in France. Catholics blamed her for failing to complete the extermination of Protestantism. Protestants blamed her for attempting systematic elimination against their communities. Moderate nobles blamed her for polarizing the kingdom beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. The isolation that Isabella experienced during her final years in power was perhaps the cruelest irony of her entire career. The woman who had spent decades building elaborate networks of allies, informants, and political partnerships found herself increasingly alone as former supporters abandoned her and potential new allies refused to associate themselves with her toxic reputation. Isabella's response to this isolation was to become even more paranoid and controlling than she had been during her previous decades in power. She began suspecting conspiracy everywhere, interpreting every political setback as evidence of elaborate plots against her authority. Her correspondence from this period shows a woman who had completely lost touch with political reality, seeing enemies in every shadow and betrayal in every disappointing outcome. But Isabella's most desperate and ultimately self-destructive decision during this period was her choice to eliminate Henry de Guise through a direct confrontation at the royal palace. In December 1588, Isabella convinced her son to summon Guise to a meeting at the Château de Blois, where royal guards would eliminate the Catholic League leader while he was supposedly under the protection of royal hospitality. The plan worked exactly as Isabella had designed it. Guise arrived at the palace expecting a routine political negotiation and was instead eliminated by royal guardsmen who had been positioned throughout the building. But Isabella had fatally misunderstood the political climate in which she was operating. The techniques that had worked so effectively during the August elimination campaign were now being applied to a completely different situation with catastrophic results. The elimination of Henry de Guise triggered exactly the kind of popular uprising that Isabella had spent her entire career trying to prevent. Paris erupted in riots as Catholic League supporters took control of entire neighborhoods, declared the royal monarchy illegitimate, and began organizing military resistance to royal authority. Within days of Guise's death, Henry III and Isabella were forced to flee their own capital city as revolutionary crowds threatened to storm the palace and eliminate the entire royal family. Isabella de Medici, the woman who had once controlled France through an intricate web of political manipulation and carefully orchestrated violence, now found herself a refugee from the very kingdom she had spent decades trying to secure. The merchant's daughter, who had transformed herself into the most powerful woman in Europe, was reduced to hiding in provincial castles while her enemies celebrated their victory in the streets of Paris. The final months of Isabella's life were spent watching everything she had worked to build collapse around her. Protestant armies advanced toward the capital from the south. Catholic League forces controlled Paris and were actively recruiting foreign military support to overthrow the monarchy. Her son, Henry III, was essentially king of nothing, commanding the loyalty of only a handful of nobles who remained committed to the royal dynasty. Isabella's health began failing rapidly as the stress of political defeat combined with the physical exhaustion of constant travel and the psychological trauma of seeing her life's work destroyed. She had always been a woman of tremendous physical and mental energy, but the combination of political failure and advancing age was finally taking its toll on someone who had spent over 40 years operating at the highest levels of European politics. On January 5, 1589, Isabella de Medici died at the age of 69 in the Château de Blois, the same palace where she had ordered the elimination that triggered her final political downfall. Her last words were reportedly a warning to her son about the dangers of showing mercy to political enemies, advice that perfectly summarized the philosophy that had guided her entire approach to governing France. Isabella's death removed the last restraining influence on Henry III's increasingly erratic behavior. Within months of his mother's funeral, the king was making even more desperate political decisions, including an alliance with Protestant forces against the Catholic League that would have horrified Isabella. In August 1589, Henry III himself was eliminated by a Catholic extremist who considered the king a traitor to the faith. The death of Henry III marked the end of the royal dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in French history under Henry IV, the Protestant king who would eventually convert to Catholicism and bring the religious wars to an end through the kind of political compromise that Isabella had always rejected. The woman who had tried to solve France's problems through systematic elimination and political terror was ultimately succeeded by a ruler who achieved peace through tolerance and negotiation. But Isabella's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions. The techniques she had developed for political control, the use of intelligence networks to monitor potential opposition, the coordination of government policy with religious extremism, the manipulation of popular fears to justify authoritarian measures, and most importantly, the willingness to use systematic violence as a tool of statecraft would be studied and copied by ambitious rulers for centuries to come. The August elimination campaign became a template for politically motivated removal of populations that would be referenced during some of the darkest chapters in human history. Isabella's demonstration that religious differences could justify the systematic elimination of entire communities provided a precedent that would be cited by advocates of ethnic cleansing and religious persecution well into the modern era. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Isabella's career illustrated how quickly sophisticated political systems could be corrupted by leaders who prioritize personal power over moral constraints. The Renaissance court that she had inherited was a center of artistic achievement, intellectual advancement, and diplomatic sophistication. Under her influence, it became a machine for producing political terror and religious warfare. Isabella de Medici's transformation from a powerless foreign bride into the most feared ruler in Europe represents one of the most complete examples in history of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. Her story serves as a warning about what happens when intelligence and determination are combined with moral blindness and unlimited ambition. The woman they called the Shadow Queen had indeed cast a shadow over more than her political enemies. She had darkened the very concept of legitimate government, turning the French monarchy into something that inspired fear rather than respect and violence rather than loyalty. Her reign demonstrated that it was possible for a single individual to inflict damage on an entire civilization that would take generations to repair. Yet Isabella's story also reveals something important about the nature of political power itself. Despite all her intelligence, all her cunning, and all her ruthless determination, she ultimately failed to achieve her most basic objective, securing her dynasty's control over France. The very methods she used to gain power eventually made it impossible for her family to retain that power. The lesson of Isabella de Medici's career is not that ruthless ambition cannot succeed in politics, but rather that success achieved through purely ruthless means tends to be self-defeating in the long run. The fear and hatred that Isabella generated through her reign of terror eventually created more enemies than even her formidable political skills could manage. Isabella's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between effective leadership and moral behavior. She was undeniably one of the most capable political operators in European history, possessing skills that allowed her to outmaneuver opponents, build complex alliances, and implement sophisticated strategies with remarkable success. But her moral blindness ultimately made all of those skills irrelevant. The merchant's daughter, who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of a throne she never inherited by birth, had indeed proven something about her capabilities. But what she proved was that it was possible to be simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, successful and ultimately self-destructive, feared and ultimately despised. Isabella de Medici's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that the question facing every political leader is not whether they have the skills to gain and maintain power, but whether they have the wisdom and moral courage to use that power in ways that actually serve the people they claim to represent. The Shadow Queen had answered that question in the most definitive way possible, and the answer had darkened everything she touched. Her story continues to fascinate historians and political scientists because it represents such a complete case study in the corruption of power and the self-defeating nature of political extremism. Isabella's reign provides a textbook example of how even the most sophisticated political strategies become counterproductive when they are divorced from any consideration of moral consequences. But perhaps the most important lesson of Isabella's career is that the techniques she pioneered for maintaining political control through fear and violence did not die with her. The methods she developed for manipulating popular opinion, eliminating political opposition, and using religious extremism as a tool of statecraft have been refined and employed by authoritarian leaders throughout history. Understanding Isabella de Medici's story is therefore not just an exercise in historical curiosity, but a crucial part of recognizing and resisting the kinds of political manipulation that continue to threaten democratic societies today. The Shadow Queen's legacy lives on wherever leaders choose power over principle, fear over hope, and violence over justice. The woman who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a foreign merchant's daughter had indeed changed the course of European history, but not in the way she had intended. Instead of securing her family's dynasty, she had demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to build lasting political success on a foundation of systematic elimination and moral corruption. Isabella de Medici's reign stands as one of history's most powerful arguments for the proposition that how we achieve power matters just as much as whether we achieve it, and that the methods we use to govern ultimately determine whether our legacy will be one of progress or destruction. The devastating irony of Isabella's final years becomes even more apparent when we examine what happened to the kingdom she had sacrificed everything to control. By 1589, France was in such complete chaos that foreign observers wondered if the nation would simply cease to exist as a unified political entity. The sophisticated Renaissance monarchy that Isabella had inherited had been transformed into something resembling a collection of warring medieval territories. Consider the perspective of ordinary French citizens during this period. Marie de Bourg was a baker's wife living in Lyon, one of France's most prosperous cities. In 1559, when Isabella first became regent, Marie's family had enjoyed the stability and prosperity that came with living in a well-governed Renaissance kingdom. The de Bois bakery served customers from across the social spectrum, from wealthy merchants to struggling artisans, all of whom could afford bread because the French economy was fundamentally sound. By 1589, Marie's world had been completely destroyed by Isabella's reign of terror. 3 of her sons had died in religious wars. Her husband had been conscripted into a Catholic League militia that spent more time raiding than fighting. The bakery had been burned down twice, first by Protestant raiders, and then by Catholic extremists who suspected the family of harboring Protestant sympathies. Marie spent her final years as a refugee in her own country, moving from town to town with whatever possessions she could carry, never knowing whether the next group of soldiers she encountered would protect her or harm her, based on their interpretation of her religious loyalties. The stable, prosperous France of her youth had been replaced by a landscape where survival depended on correctly guessing which faction controlled whatever territory you happened to be crossing. Stories like Marie's were replicated hundreds of thousands of times across France during Isabella's reign. Entire regions that had been centers of commerce and culture were depopulated by violence, disease, and starvation. Cities that had been architectural marvels were reduced to rubble by successive sieges. The sophisticated road networks that had connected French communities were abandoned because travel had become too dangerous for ordinary civilians. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Isabella's legacy was what happened to the concept of royal authority itself. For centuries, French kings had been regarded by their subjects as legitimate rulers appointed by divine will to govern with wisdom and justice. Even during periods of political conflict, there had been a fundamental assumption that the monarchy represented stability and continuity in French society. Isabella's reign had completely shattered that assumption. By the time of her death, the French monarchy was seen by most of the population as nothing more than another armed faction competing for control through violence and intimidation. The sacred nature of royal authority had been permanently damaged by Isabella's demonstration that kings and queens were just as capable of systematic elimination as any common criminal. The psychological damage Isabella inflicted on French society extended beyond the immediate trauma of religious warfare. She had fundamentally altered how French people thought about political power, religious identity, and social cooperation. The Renaissance optimism that had characterized early 16th century France, with its belief in human reason and the possibility of progress, had been replaced by a deep cynicism about human nature and political institutions. Jean-Baptiste Morel was a young philosophy student at the University of Paris when Isabella orchestrated the August Elimination Campaign. He had been studying the humanist texts that celebrated human dignity and the possibility of creating just societies through rational discourse and mutual understanding. The morning after the campaign, Jean-Baptiste walked through streets littered with the remains of people whose only crime had been belonging to the wrong religious community. The experience destroyed Jean-Baptiste's faith in the Renaissance ideals he had been studying. He abandoned his philosophical pursuits and spent the rest of his life as a bitter, cynical merchant who trusted no one and expected the worst from every political situation. His personal transformation mirrored what was happening to French society as a whole under Isabella's influence. The intellectual and cultural achievements that had made 16th century France a center of European Renaissance culture were systematically destroyed by the climate of fear and violence that Isabella had created. Artists fled the country rather than risk being caught up in religious persecution. Scholars abandoned their research to focus on basic survival. The patronage networks that had supported cultural innovation were disrupted by constant warfare and economic collapse. Isabella had not just failed to secure her dynasty's political control over France. She had actively destroyed the foundations of the civilization she claimed to be protecting. The Renaissance kingdom she had inherited was replaced by something that resembled the darkest periods of medieval conflict, but with the added efficiency that came from applying Renaissance organizational skills to the task of systematic destruction. The international consequences of Isabella's reign were equally devastating for French interests. European powers that had once regarded France as a sophisticated ally or formidable rival now saw it as a chaotic, failed state that posed no serious threat to anyone except its own population. Spain, England, and the German principalities began making plans for partitioning French territory once the kingdom finally collapsed. Completely. Ambassador reports from this period reveal the complete collapse of France's diplomatic credibility. Foreign courts that had once competed for French alliance now avoided association with a regime that was internationally synonymous with political incompetence and religious fanaticism. Isabella's reputation as the Shadow Queen had become so notorious that other European rulers, worried about being contaminated by any connection to her family, thought the economic consequences of Isabella's policies were perhaps even more destructive than the immediate political chaos. France had been one of Europe's wealthiest kingdoms at the beginning of Isabella's regency, with thriving commercial networks, productive agricultural regions, and innovative manufacturing centers. By the end of her reign, the French economy had contracted by an estimated 40%, with entire industries disappearing and formerly prosperous regions reduced to subsistence-level poverty. Consider what happened to the French textile industry, which had been one of the kingdom's most important sources of wealth and international trade. Protestant merchants and craftsmen had played crucial roles in developing innovative production techniques and establishing trading relationships with foreign markets. Isabella's persecution of Protestant communities destroyed much of this expertise and commercial infrastructure. Pierrefontaine had been a master weaver in the city of Tours, where his family had been producing luxury fabrics for 3 generations. His workshop employed over 50 people and sold textiles throughout Europe. Pierre's Protestant faith made him a target during the religious wars, and in 1576, His entire operation was destroyed by Catholic League militants who accused him of using his commercial contacts to fund Protestant military activities. Pierre escaped with his life, but lost everything else. His skilled workers were scattered, his equipment was destroyed, and his commercial relationships were severed. He spent his remaining years as a day laborer, watching as the French textile industry that his family had helped build was systematically dismantled by the religious conflicts Isabella had deliberately encouraged. Similar stories played out across every sector of the French economy. Banking networks that had facilitated international trade were disrupted by religious persecution. Agricultural productivity declined as farming communities were repeatedly devastated by military campaigns. Urban centers that had been engines of innovation became depopulated ruins where survivors focused entirely on basic survival. The demographic impact of Isabella's reign was equally catastrophic. Historians estimate that France's population declined by approximately 15% during the 3 decades of religious warfare that she either directly caused or deliberately prolonged. This was not just a matter of battlefield casualties. Entire regions experienced population collapse due to disease, starvation, and mass migration. The city of La Rochelle provides a particularly stark example of this demographic catastrophe. In 1560, La Rochelle had been a thriving port city with over 30,000 residents engaged in international commerce, shipbuilding, and related industries. The city's Protestant majority made it a target for Isabella's persecution, and by 1590, the population had fallen to fewer than 8,000 survivors, living in a partially ruined urban landscape. What happened to La Rochelle's missing 22,000 residents? Some died in military campaigns. Others succumbed to the diseases that regularly swept through areas disrupted by warfare. Many simply fled the country, taking their skills and resources to Protestant strongholds in the Netherlands, England, or German territories where they could practice their religion without fear of systematic elimination. This pattern of population loss and economic disruption was replicated throughout France, creating a downward spiral where violence led to economic collapse, which created desperation that fueled more violence. Isabella had trapped her kingdom in a cycle of self-destruction that seemed impossible to break through conventional political means. But perhaps the most profound way Isabella damaged French civilization was through her corruption of the moral and intellectual framework that held society together. Renaissance France had been characterized by a complex but functional system of mutual obligations and shared values that allowed people with different backgrounds and beliefs to coexist within a common political framework. Isabella's reign demonstrated that these social bonds were far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Her deliberate strategy of encouraging extremism to maintain her own power showed how quickly a sophisticated society could degenerate into tribal warfare when its leaders abandoned any pretense of serving the common good. The legal system that had been one of France's most impressive institutional achievements was completely corrupted by Isabella's reign. Courts that had been respected for their fairness and expertise became instruments of political persecution, where verdicts were determined by religious identity rather than evidence. The tradition of legal scholarship that had made French universities centers of European jurisprudence was abandoned as lawyers focused on survival rather than intellectual advancement. Francois Leberton had been a respected judge in the Paris Parliament, known for his careful analysis of legal precedents and his reputation for impartiality. During Isabella's reign, Franco was forced to participate in show trials where Protestant defendants were condemned regardless of the evidence. He watched his profession degenerate from a learned pursuit dedicated to justice into a crude tool for religious persecution. Franco's personal journals from this period reveal the psychological toll of being forced to participate in a system he knew was fundamentally corrupt. He describes the shame of rendering verdicts he knew were unjust, the fear of being accused of insufficient Catholic zeal, and the gradual erosion of his belief in the possibility of fair legal proceedings. By the end of Isabella's reign, Francois had become a broken man who drank heavily and avoided social contact because he could no longer bear to face the families of people he had been forced to condemn. The educational system that had made France a center of European intellectual life suffered similar corruption under Isabella's influence. Universities that had been dedicated to free inquiry and scholarly debate became centers of religious indoctrination where questioning official doctrine could result in imprisonment or death. The humanist curriculum that had encouraged critical thinking was replaced by narrow theological training designed to produce religious extremists rather than educated citizens. Professor Antoine Rousseau had taught rhetoric and philosophy at the University of Orleans for over 20 years when Isabella's reign began. He had been known for encouraging students to examine different philosophical traditions and to develop their own reasoned positions on complex questions. During the religious wars, Antoine was forced to abandon this approach in favor of rote memorization of Catholic doctrine. Antoine's correspondence reveals his despair at watching his students transform from curious young scholars into rigid fanatics who were more interested in identifying heretics than in pursuing knowledge. The intellectual excitement that had characterized his early career was replaced by a dreary routine of indoctrination that served Isabella's political needs, but destroyed the educational mission he had devoted his life to, serving the artistic and cultural achievements that had made the French Renaissance court a model for European civilization were similarly destroyed by Isabella's reign. The patronage system that had supported painters, musicians, architects, and writers was disrupted by constant warfare and the climate of fear that made artistic expression dangerous if it could be interpreted as politically or religiously subversive. Margaret de Navarre the Younger, a poet and playwright who had been one of the most celebrated artists of her generation, found herself unable to continue her creative work during Isabella's reign. Her poetry, which had explored themes of love, spirituality, and human nature, was deemed potentially heretical by religious authorities who examined every artistic work for signs of Protestant sympathies. Margaret spent her final years in self-imposed silence, destroying manuscripts she feared could be used as evidence against her, and avoiding the literary circles where she had once been a central figure. The vibrant cultural life that had flourished during the early French Renaissance was replaced by a sterile environment where artistic expression was subordinated to religious and political orthodoxy. The architectural projects that had been transforming French cities into showcases of Renaissance design were abandoned as resources were diverted to military fortifications, and the funds that had supported cultural patronage were consumed by the costs of constant warfare. The chateaux that had been symbols of French sophistication were converted into military strongholds, or left to decay as their owners fled the country or died in religious conflicts. Isabella's impact on French religious life was equally destructive, but in ways that went far beyond the immediate violence of the religious wars. The sophisticated theological traditions that had characterized both French Catholicism and the early Protestant movement were replaced by crude extremism that emphasized hatred of religious opponents, rather than spiritual development or intellectual understanding. The monastery of St. Denis, which had been a center of Catholic scholarship for centuries, was transformed during Isabella's reign into something resembling a military recruiting center, where monks spent more time planning attacks on Protestant communities and studying scripture or serving the poor. The intellectual tradition that had produced some of Europe's most respected theologians was abandoned in favor of inflammatory preaching designed to encourage violence against religious minorities. Father Guillaume Morin had been a respected scholar at St. Denis, known for his commentaries on medieval theology and his efforts to promote understanding between different Christian traditions. During Isabella's reign, Guillaume was pressured to abandon his scholarly work in favor of delivering sermons that portrayed Protestants as demonic enemies who deserved extermination. Guillaume's private writings reveal his horror at being forced to preach hatred rather than love, and his growing conviction that Isabella's manipulation of religious feelings was fundamentally anti-Christian. He died in 1585, reportedly of a broken heart, after watching his beloved monastery transform into an institution he no longer recognized. The Protestant communities that survived Isabella's persecution were similarly damaged by the extremism her policies encouraged. Churches that had emphasized education, social service, and theological reflection became militarized organizations focused primarily on physical survival. The intellectual achievements of early French Protestantism were largely lost as communities devoted all their resources to military resistance. Pastor Jean Calvin the Younger, son of the famous reformer, had been working to develop a sophisticated Protestant theological tradition that could engage intellectually with Catholic scholarship while maintaining Reformed principles. Isabella's persecution forced him to abandon this work in favor of organizing military resistance and providing pastoral care to communities under constant threat of elimination. Jean's later writings reflect his bitterness at seeing his life's work destroyed by political circumstances beyond his control. The theological synthesis he had hoped to create was never completed because the intellectual environment necessary for such work had been destroyed by Isabella's reign of terror. The long-term consequences of Isabella's destruction of French intellectual and cultural life extended far beyond her own lifetime. France, which had been positioned to become the leading center of European Renaissance culture, instead fell behind other nations that had managed to avoid similar periods of internal chaos and religious warfare. The Netherlands, which welcomed many French Protestant refugees, experienced a cultural golden age during the late 16th and early 17th centuries that was fueled in part by the talents and resources that had fled Isabella's persecution. England, which had managed its own religious conflicts more successfully, began to surpass France in areas like literature, philosophy, and scientific innovation. France would eventually recover from Isabella's reign and go on to achieve new cultural heights during the 17th century. But the Renaissance momentum that had been building during the early 16th century was permanently lost. The kingdom that should have been leading European civilization instead spent decades rebuilding from the devastation that one woman's ruthless ambition had inflicted. Isabella's personal responsibility for this cultural catastrophe cannot be understated. She had inherited a kingdom that was well positioned to become the dominant force in European Renaissance culture, with established traditions of intellectual excellence, artistic innovation, and international influence. Through her deliberate choices, she transformed that inheritance into a legacy of violence, extremism, and civilizational decline. The woman who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority had instead demonstrated how quickly even the most sophisticated political systems could be destroyed by leaders who prioritize personal power over the common good. Isabella's reign stands as one of history's most complete examples of how individual moral corruption can inflict damage on entire civilizations that takes generations to repair. But even as Isabella's legacy of destruction became increasingly apparent during her final years, she remained convinced that her methods were not only justified but necessary for protecting France from its enemies. Her correspondence from the 1580s shows no recognition of the role her own policies had played in creating the chaos that was consuming the kingdom she claimed to love. This capacity for self-deception was perhaps Isabella's most dangerous quality, and it helps explain how someone with such obvious intelligence and political skill could consistently make decisions that were so obviously self-destructive. She had created a psychological framework that allowed her to interpret any criticism of her methods as evidence of her enemy's unreasonable hatred rather than legitimate concerns about her policies. Isabella's final letters to foreign rulers reveal a woman who genuinely believed she had been a successful monarch who had protected France from religious extremism and foreign domination. She seemed incapable of recognizing that the extremism and chaos that characterized her final years were largely the product of her own political choices rather than external forces beyond her control. This psychological blindness made Isabella particularly dangerous because it prevented her from learning from her mistakes or adapting her strategies when they proved counterproductive. A ruler with normal capacity for self-reflection might have recognized that the August elimination campaign had backfired and adjusted their approach accordingly. Isabella instead doubled down on violence and extremism because she could not acknowledge that her original strategy had been fundamentally flawed. The tragedy of Isabella's reign was not that she was incompetent or lacking in political skills. She was by any objective measure one of the most capable political operators of her era, with an impressive ability to analyze complex situations, develop sophisticated strategies, and implement her plans with remarkable attention to detail. Her failure was moral rather than intellectual, stemming from her complete inability to consider the human cost of her political ambitions. This combination of exceptional ability and moral blindness made Isabella far more dangerous than a simple tyrant or incompetent ruler would have been. She had all the skills necessary to implement her vision for France, but that vision was so warped by paranoia and ruthless ambition that it threatened the very foundations of the civilization she claimed to be protecting. The lesson of Isabella's career is not that political skill is unimportant, but rather that skill without moral guidance becomes a force for destruction rather than progress. Her story serves as a permanent reminder that the question facing every political leader is not whether they have the ability to gain and maintain power, but whether they have the wisdom and character to use that power in ways that actually serve their people's interests. Isabella de' Medici had answered that question through her actions, and the answer had cast shadows over everything she touched. The merchant's daughter, who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority, had instead provided one of history's most compelling arguments for why moral character matters more than political skill in determining whether a leader will be remembered as a blessing or a curse to their people. Her reign demonstrated that it was possible to be simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, successful in the short term and ultimately self-defeating, feared by enemies and despised by subjects. Isabella had achieved a kind of political success, but at a cost that made that success worthless. Both for herself and for the kingdom, she had sacrificed everything to control. The Shadow Queen's legacy would outlive her by centuries, serving as a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the devastating consequences of leadership, divorced from moral constraint. But in the immediate aftermath of her death, France faced the urgent task of somehow recovering from the damage she had inflicted and rebuilding the foundations of civilized society that her reign had systematically destroyed. The man who would ultimately end Isabella's reign of terror was someone she had never expected to threaten her power. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who had married her daughter Margaret during that fateful wedding celebration in 1572, and somehow survived the August elimination campaign and spent the following years building exactly the kind of coalition that Isabella had always feared most. But Henry was not just another Protestant rebel leader seeking revenge for past atrocities. He was something far more dangerous to Isabella's legacy. a genuinely skilled politician who understood that France's salvation lay not in more violence, but in the radical concept of religious tolerance. While Isabella had spent decades trying to solve political problems through elimination and systematic violence, Henry was quietly demonstrating that compromise and coexistence might actually work. Picture the scene in 1589 as Henry of Navarre prepared to march on Paris to claim the throne that had become his by right after Henry III's elimination. This was not a vengeful Protestant army seeking to burn down Catholic churches and harm innocent civilians. This was a disciplined military force led by a man who had learned from Isabella's mistakes and was determined not to repeat them. Henry's army included both Protestant and Catholic soldiers who had grown exhausted with the religious warfare that had consumed their lives for decades. These were not fanatics driven by theological hatred, but practical men who simply wanted to live in a kingdom where they could practice their faith, support their families, and pursue their trades without fear of being eliminated by their neighbors. Captain Pierre Morel was a Catholic officer who had joined Henry's army after watching his hometown of Chartres change hands 6 times during the religious wars. Each transition had brought new waves of persecution, revenge killings, and economic disruption that made normal life impossible for ordinary citizens. Pierre did not particularly care about Protestant theology, but he had become convinced that Henry offered the only realistic hope for ending the cycle of violence that Isabella's policies had created. Pierre's decision to support a Protestant king despite his own Catholic faith represented a fundamental shift in how French people were thinking about politics and religion. Isabella had spent her entire career trying to convince the population that religious differences made political cooperation impossible. Henry was proving that shared citizenship and common interests could be more powerful than theological disputes. Meanwhile, in the papal palace at Rome, Pope Sixtus V was facing a diplomatic crisis that perfectly illustrated how completely Isabella's policies had backfired. The Pope had initially supported Isabella's persecution of French Protestants, believing that religious unity was essential for political stability. By 1589, he was watching Catholic League extremists threaten to tear apart the very Catholic monarchy that their persecution had been designed to protect. Cardinal Alessandro Peretti, the Pope's nephew and closest advisor, had been receiving increasingly alarming reports from France about the Catholic League's activities. These were not the disciplined defenders of Catholic orthodoxy that Rome had expected to support. They were armed fanatics who seemed more interested in raiding and settling personal scores than in advancing any coherent religious or political program. Alessandro's correspondence reveals his growing horror as he realized that Isabella's approach to religious conflict had created exactly the kind of chaos that undermined both royal authority and Catholic interests. The cardinal began secretly advising his uncle to consider supporting Henry of Navarre's claim to the French throne, even if it meant accepting a Protestant king, because the alternative seemed to be the complete collapse of organized government in France. This shift in papal thinking represented a devastating repudiation of everything Isabella had claimed to be fighting for. She had justified decades of persecution and systematic elimination as necessary to protect Catholic interests and maintain religious unity. Now, the head of the Catholic Church himself was beginning to question whether her methods had actually strengthened or weakened the cause she claimed to serve. But perhaps the most powerful indictment of Isabella's legacy came from the ordinary French people who had lived through her reign of terror and were finally being offered an alternative. When Henry of Navarre issued his famous declaration promising religious tolerance and an end to persecution, the response from war-weary communities across France was overwhelmingly positive. Marie Blanchard was a Catholic seamstress living in the city of Rouen. When Henry's declaration reached her community, Marie had lost 2 sons in religious warfare, had seen her neighborhood burned by Protestant raiders, and had watched Catholic extremists execute her Protestant neighbors during a particularly vicious outbreak of sectarian violence. She had no particular love for Protestant theology, but she was desperate for any leader who promised to end the cycle of killing that had dominated her adult life. Marie's reaction was typical of millions of French citizens who had grown exhausted with the religious extremism that Isabella's policies had encouraged. These people were not interested in complex theological debates or sophisticated political theories. They simply wanted to live in a kingdom where they could worship according to their conscience, earn a living through honest work, and raise their children without fear of religious persecution. Henry of Navarre understood this popular longing for peace and stability in ways that Isabella never had. While she had always seen religious differences as irreconcilable conflicts that could only be resolved through the elimination of one side or the other, Henry recognized that most people care more about practical concerns like security, prosperity, and family welfare than about abstract theological disputes. This insight would prove to be the key to Henry's success and the foundation of his eventual transformation into Henry IV, one of France's most beloved kings. But in 1589, as he prepared to challenge the chaos that Isabella's reign had created, Henry first had to overcome the military and political obstacles that stood between him and the throne he was determined to claim. The Catholic League that controlled Paris was led by Charles of Mayenne, Henry de Guise's brother, who had inherited both his family's political ambitions and their hatred for the royal dynasty. Mayenne had built a formidable military coalition that included Spanish financial support, papal blessing, and the enthusiastic participation of Catholic extremists who viewed Henry's Protestant faith as an absolute disqualification for royal authority. But Mayenne had also inherited the fundamental weakness that had ultimately doomed Isabella's political strategy. His movement was defined primarily by what it opposed rather than what it stood for. The Catholic League could unite around hatred for Protestant heretics and disgust with royal weakness, but it had no coherent vision for how France should actually be governed once its enemies were eliminated. Father Louis Richiome was a Jesuit priest who had initially supported the Catholic League because he believed that religious orthodoxy was essential for social stability. As he watched Mayenne's forces occupy Paris and begin implementing their vision of Catholic governance, Father Louis became increasingly disturbed by what he witnessed. The Catholic League's rule in Paris was characterized by the same kind of arbitrary violence and extremist rhetoric that had marked Isabella's worst periods of religious persecution. Suspected Protestant sympathizers were arrested on the basis of anonymous denunciations. Catholic moderates who advocated for political compromise were accused of insufficient religious zeal. The sophisticated legal and administrative systems that had made Paris a center of European civilization were replaced by revolutionary tribunals that rendered verdicts based on religious and political orthodoxy rather than evidence or established law. Father Louis's private journals from this period reveal his growing conviction that the Catholic League had become something fundamentally anti-Christian in its methods, even as it claimed to be defending Christian principles. He describes watching League militants torture prisoners to extract confessions of heresy, witnessing summary executions of people whose only crime was advocating for religious tolerance, and seeing Catholic churches transformed into centers of political indoctrination rather than spiritual worship. The priests' disillusionment with Catholic extremism was shared by increasing numbers of French Catholics who had initially supported the League, but were horrified by its actual practices. Isabella's strategy of encouraging religious fanaticism to serve her political purposes had created a monster that even many Catholics found repulsive and dangerous. Meanwhile, Henry of Navarre was demonstrating through his own conduct that Protestant leadership did not necessarily threaten Catholic interests or French traditions. His army maintained strict discipline, protected Catholic churches and monasteries, and treated captured enemies with a degree of mercy that stood in stark contrast to the behavior of Catholic League forces. Jean-Baptiste Fontaine was a Catholic nobleman who had been captured during one of Henry's military campaigns and expected to be executed as an enemy of the Protestant cause. Instead, he found himself treated as an honored prisoner of war, allowed to attend Catholic Mass, and eventually released without ransom as a gesture of goodwill toward Catholic communities that might be considering whether to support Henry's claim to the throne. Jean-Baptiste's experience convinced him that Henry represented a fundamentally different approach to political leadership than what France had experienced during Isabella's reign. This was not a ruler who saw political opponents as enemies to be eliminated, but someone who understood that lasting political success required building bridges between different communities rather than burning them down. The contrast between Henry's approach and Isabella's legacy became even more apparent when Henry issued his famous declaration that Paris is worth a mass. This was not just a cynical political calculation, though it was certainly that. It was also a demonstration of the kind of practical flexibility that Isabella had never possessed, and that France desperately needed if it was going to recover from decades of religious warfare. Henry's willingness to convert to Catholicism in order to unite the kingdom represented everything Isabella had claimed to want, but had never been able to achieve. She had spent her entire career trying to create Catholic unity through persecution and violence. Henry accomplished the same goal through compromise and inclusion, demonstrating that her methods had been not just morally wrong but strategically counterproductive. Cardinal Arnaud d'Azat was the papal representative who negotiated Henry's conversion and reconciliation with the Catholic Church. The cardinal had been deeply skeptical of accepting a formerly Protestant king, but his correspondence reveals his growing admiration for Henry's genuine commitment to religious tolerance and political moderation. Cardinal d'Ossat's reports to Rome emphasized that Henry's conversion was not just a political convenience, but reflected a sincere desire to heal the wounds that religious conflict had inflicted on French society. The new king demonstrated his commitment to Catholic interests while simultaneously protecting Protestant communities from the kind of persecution that had characterized Isabella's reign. This balancing act required political skills of the highest order, and Henry's success in maintaining it demonstrated just how unnecessarily destructive Isabella's approach had been. She had always claimed that religious coexistence was impossible, and that political stability required the elimination of religious diversity. Henry proved that both claims were false by creating exactly the kind of religiously diverse but politically unified kingdom that Isabella had insisted could never exist. The economic recovery that began under Henry's rule provided perhaps the most damning evidence of how completely Isabella's policies had failed even on their own terms. She had justified decades of persecution and warfare as necessary to protect French interests and maintain political stability. The immediate improvement in economic conditions once Henry ended religious persecution demonstrated that Isabella's methods had been the primary obstacle to French prosperity and security. Guillaume Mercier was a merchant in the city of Lyon who had watched his business collapse during the religious wars as trade networks were disrupted by constant warfare and religious persecution. Under Henry's rule, Guillaume found that Protestant and Catholic merchants could once again cooperate in commercial ventures without fear that religious differences would lead to violence or legal persecution. Guillaume's account books from this period show a dramatic increase in both domestic and international trade as confidence Return to French markets. Foreign merchants who had avoided France during Isabella's reign began returning, as word spread that the new king offered genuine protection for commercial activities regardless of the participants' religious affiliations. The revival of French commerce under Henry's tolerant policies provided concrete evidence that Isabella's approach to religious diversity had been economically as well as morally catastrophic. The kingdom that she had claimed to be protecting through persecution had actually been systematically weakened by her methods, while the religious tolerance she had always rejected proved to be the foundation of renewed prosperity. Henry's success in rebuilding French civilization also highlighted how completely Isabella had misunderstood the nature of political authority and the sources of legitimate government. She had always believed that fear was the most reliable foundation for political control, that subjects needed to be intimidated into obedience, and that mercy was a sign of weakness that encouraged rebellion. Henry demonstrated that exactly the opposite was true. His willingness to forgive former enemies, protect religious minorities, and govern through persuasion rather than coercion created a kind of popular loyalty that Isabella had never achieved despite decades of effort. French people supported Henry not because they were afraid of him, but because they trusted him to govern in their interests, rather than purely for his own political advantage. This popular support gave Henry a kind of political strength that Isabella had never possessed even at the height of her power. She had always ruled through complex networks of allies who supported her because they feared the consequences of opposition or hoped to benefit from her favor. Henry ruled through genuine popular consent from subjects who believed that his success was connected to their own welfare. The contrast was most visible in how the two rulers dealt with political opposition and dissent. Isabella had consistently responded to criticism with violence, treating any questioning of her policies as evidence of treasonous conspiracy that needed to be eliminated through removal or persecution. Henry actively encouraged debate and discussion, recognizing that legitimate opposition could actually strengthen his government by forcing him to consider different perspectives and adjust his policies when they proved ineffective. Professor Antoine Rabel was a scholar at the University of Paris who had been forced into exile during Isabella's reign because his writings on political philosophy were deemed too sympathetic to Protestant ideas about religious tolerance and limited government. Under Henry's rule, Professor Rabel was able to return to France and resume his scholarly work without fear of persecution. Professor Rabel's later writings provide a detailed analysis of the differences between Isabella's authoritarian approach and Henry's more consultative style of governance. He describes how Henry actively sought advice from scholars, merchants, and other educated citizens, treating their expertise as a valuable resource rather than viewing their independence as a threat to royal authority. This willingness to listen to criticism and incorporate different perspectives into government policy represented a fundamental rejection of everything Isabella had believed about political leadership. She had always seen governance as a zero-sum competition where any limitation on royal authority represented a dangerous concession to potentially rebellious subjects. Henry understood that effective governance required building consensus and cooperation, rather than simply imposing the ruler's will through force. His success in rebuilding French institutions demonstrated that Isabella's authoritarian methods had been not just morally questionable but practically counterproductive. The religious settlement that Henry negotiated through the Edict of Nantes in 1598 stands as perhaps the most complete repudiation of Isabella's entire approach to religious diversity. Where she had insisted that religious unity could only be achieved through the elimination of religious minorities, Henry created a legal framework that protected both Catholic and Protestant communities while maintaining overall political unity. The edict granted French Protestants the right to worship freely in designated areas, hold public office, maintain their own schools and universities, and even garrison certain fortified cities for their protection. At the same time, it reaffirmed Catholicism as the official religion of France and guaranteed Catholic control over most public institutions. This compromise satisfied neither religious extremists on either side, but it created exactly the kind of stable, prosperous, and peaceful kingdom that Isabella had always claimed to be working toward. The fact that Henry achieved through tolerance and compromise what Isabella had failed to accomplish through decades of persecution and violence provided a devastating critique of her entire political philosophy. Pastor Samuel Busher was a Protestant minister who had spent Isabella's reign hiding in caves and abandoned buildings to avoid the persecution that had driven most of his colleagues into exile or to their deaths. Under Henry's rule, Pastor Busher was able to establish a thriving congregation in the city of Caen, where Protestant and Catholic citizens coexisted peacefully and often collaborated on community projects. Pastor Busher's sermons from this period emphasized themes of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the possibility of building a society based on mutual respect rather than religious hatred. His success in attracting both Protestant and Catholic audiences to interfaith discussions about moral and social questions demonstrated that the religious antagonism Isabella had always assumed was inevitable was actually largely the product of her own policies. The cultural renaissance that flourished under Henry's rule provided additional evidence of how completely Isabella's reign had stifled French intellectual and artistic development. The climate of fear and persecution that had characterized her later years was replaced by an environment that encouraged creativity, innovation, and the kind of cultural exchange that had made early 16th century France a center of European Renaissance achievement. Playwright Jean Rotrou was one of many artists who returned from exile to contribute to the cultural revival that marked Henry's reign. His comedies and tragedies explored themes of religious reconciliation, political wisdom, and the possibility of healing the wounds that decades of civil war had inflicted on French society. Jean's most successful play, The Merchant of Rouen, told the story of a Catholic businessman and his Protestant partner who overcome religious prejudice to build a successful commercial enterprise that benefits their entire community. The play's popularity demonstrated popular hunger for narratives that emphasize cooperation and mutual understanding rather than the religious hatred that Isabella's reign had encouraged. The scientific and intellectual achievements that began to emerge under Henry's rule also highlighted how much potential Isabella's policies had wasted. French scholars who had spent decades focused on basic survival or religious controversy were finally free to pursue the kind of innovative research that had characterized the early Renaissance period. Mathematician Francois Viat made groundbreaking contributions to algebra and trigonometry that established France as a leader in mathematical innovation. His work was possible only because Henry's government provided the kind of stable, tolerant environment that allowed scholars to focus on intellectual pursuits rather than religious and political survival. Viet's correspondence reveals his gratitude for being able to work in a kingdom where scholarly merit was valued regardless of religious affiliation and where intellectual inquiry was encouraged rather than viewed as potentially subversive. His achievements represented the kind of cultural flowering that might have occurred decades earlier if Isabella had chosen tolerance over persecution as her governing philosophy. The international reputation that France began to recover under Henry's rule provided perhaps the most objective measure of how completely Isabella's reign had damaged the kingdom's standing in European affairs. Foreign courts that had spent decades viewing France as a source of instability and religious fanaticism began to see it once again as a sophisticated ally and cultural leader. Ambassador. Sir Henry Wotton represented English interests at Henry's court and sent detailed reports to London describing the transformation he witnessed in French society. His dispatches emphasized the dramatic improvement in economic conditions, the restoration of effective government institutions, and the renewal of cultural and intellectual life that characterized Henry's reign. Sir Henry's observations were particularly valuable because he had also served in France during Isabella's final years and could provide direct comparisons between the two periods. His reports consistently emphasized that the positive changes under Henry were not simply the result of ending warfare, but reflected fundamental differences in governing philosophy and political method. The English ambassador was particularly impressed by Henry's ability to maintain political unity while protecting religious diversity, something that English observers had long considered impossible based on their experience of French religious wars. Henry's success challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between religious uniformity and political stability that had shaped European political thinking for generations. Similar reports from Spanish, Italian, and German observers confirmed that Henry had accomplished something unprecedented in European politics: the creation of a stable, prosperous kingdom that protected both religious minorities and majority interests without sacrificing either political authority or economic development. These international assessments provided objective confirmation that Isabella's methods had been not just morally wrong but strategically counterproductive. The kingdom she had weakened through decades of persecution and civil war was rapidly becoming stronger and more influential under a ruler who embraced the religious tolerance she had always rejected. But perhaps the most powerful vindication of Henry's approach came from the simple fact that ordinary French people were finally able to live normal lives without constant fear of religious persecution or political violence. Families that had been separated by religious warfare were reunited. Communities that had been devastated by sectarian conflict began to rebuild. Economic activities that had been disrupted by constant uncertainty resumed and flourished. Claude Bernier was a farmer in Normandy who had watched his village change hands multiple times during the religious wars, with each transition bringing new waves of persecution, property confiscation, and forced religious conversion. Under Henry's rule, Claude was able to focus on agricultural improvement and community building rather than religious and political survival. Claude's letters to his brother in Paris describe a transformation that went far beyond simple political stability. He writes about Protestant and Catholic neighbors cooperating on harvest activities, attending each other's family celebrations, and working together on community projects like road maintenance and school construction. This kind of practical cooperation between religious communities represented exactly the kind of social healing that Isabella had always insisted was impossible. Her entire political philosophy had been based on the assumption that religious differences made peaceful coexistence unachievable, and that lasting political stability required religious uniformity enforced through persecution and violence. Henry's success in creating religiously diverse but socially unified communities demonstrated that Isabella's assumptions had been fundamentally wrong. Religious tolerance did not weaken political authority or threaten social stability. It actually strengthened both by allowing citizens to focus their energy on productive activities rather than sectarian conflict. The children who grew up under Henry's rule represented perhaps the most hopeful aspect of his achievement. These young people had no personal memory of the religious hatred and political violence that had characterized Isabella's reign. They were raised in communities where religious diversity was accepted as normal and where cooperation across religious lines was an everyday reality rather than an impossible dream. Marie-Jeanne Dubois was born in 1595, 7 years after Henry became king. She grew up in a mixed religious community where her Catholic family maintained close friendships with Protestant neighbors, attended each other's weddings and funerals, and collaborated on business ventures without religious considerations playing any significant role in their relationships. Marie Jeanne's childhood experiences represented everything Isabella had tried to prevent through her policies of religious persecution and enforced uniformity. The young woman grew up assuming that religious tolerance was natural and normal, that political authority could coexist with religious diversity, and that social cooperation was possible despite theological differences. This generational change represented Henry's most important long-term achievement and the most complete repudiation of Isabella's legacy. He had created not just political stability, but a new kind of French society where the religious fanaticism that had dominated Isabella's reign seemed like a historical aberration rather than an inevitable aspect of human nature. The France that Henry left to his successors was fundamentally different from the kingdom that Isabella had tried to create through decades of persecution and violence. It was a nation where religious minorities felt secure, where economic development flourished, where intellectual and artistic achievement was encouraged, and where political authority rested on popular consent rather than fear. Henry's elimination in 1610 by a Catholic fanatic named Francois Ravaillac demonstrated that the religious extremism Isabella had encouraged had not been completely eliminated from French society. But the overwhelming popular grief that followed Henry's death, including mourning from both Protestant and Catholic communities, showed how successfully he had built a unified kingdom based on tolerance and mutual respect. The contrast between popular reactions to Henry's death and the general indifference that it greeted Isabella's passing 21 years earlier revealed everything about the differences between their approaches to political leadership. Isabella had been feared and occasionally respected, but she had never been genuinely loved by her subjects in the way that Henry was mourned by people from all social classes and religious communities. This difference in popular affection reflected the fundamental distinction between rulers who govern through fear and those who govern through consent, between leaders who see their subjects as potential enemies to be controlled and those who treat them as fellow citizens whose welfare is connected to their own success. Henry's legacy would shape French political development for centuries to come, establishing traditions of religious tolerance, economic development, and cultural achievement that would make France a leading European power. Isabella's legacy, by contrast, served primarily as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of political extremism and moral corruption. The woman who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority through ruthless determination and political cunning had instead demonstrated how quickly even the most sophisticated civilizations could be damaged by leaders who prioritize personal power over moral principle. Her reign stood as a permanent reminder that political skill without moral wisdom was not just inadequate but actively dangerous to the societies that such leaders claimed to serve. But Isabella's story also illustrated something important about the resilience of human civilization and the possibility of recovery from even the most destructive political experiences. The France that emerged from her reign of terror was ultimately stronger and more humane than the kingdom she had inherited, not because of her contributions, but because leaders like Henry IV had learned from her mistakes and chosen fundamentally different approaches to the challenges of governance. The merchant's daughter, who had transformed herself into the most feared woman in Europe, had indeed changed the course of history, but not in the way she had intended. Her legacy served not as a model for future rulers to emulate, but as a warning about the consequences of allowing ambition to overwhelm conscience and political calculation to replace moral consideration. Isabella de' Medici's reign would be remembered not for the dynasty she had tried to secure or the enemies she had eliminated, but for the devastation she had inflicted and the lessons her failures had taught about the essential connection between moral leadership and lasting political success. The Shadow Queen had indeed cast shadows over her era, But from those shadows had eventually emerged a deeper understanding of what responsible governance required and what happened when those requirements were ignored. Her story remained relevant, not because her methods were worth copying, but because the temptations she had succumbed to, the desire for absolute control, the willingness to sacrifice moral principles for political advantage, the belief that fear was more reliable than trust as a foundation for authority, were permanent features of political life that every generation of leaders would need to recognize and resist. The transformation of France from Isabella's reign of terror to Henry's era of tolerance demonstrated that even the most damaged societies could heal if their leaders possessed the wisdom to choose cooperation over conflict, inclusion over persecution, and hope over fear. But it also showed how much unnecessary suffering could be inflicted when leaders made the opposite choices, and how long it could take to repair the damage that moral blindness and political extremism could inflict on entire civilizations. As we draw near the end of this long tale, dear listener, let us reflect on the lessons that Isabella's story offers to our own time. Her reign reminds us that the greatest threats to civilization often come not from external enemies, but from leaders who possess great ability, but lack moral wisdom, who can implement sophisticated strategies, but cannot see beyond their own immediate interests, who can inspire fear, but cannot earn genuine respect. The merchant's daughter who became the shadow Queen of France had all the skills necessary for political success, but she used those skills in service of a vision so corrupted by personal ambition that it ultimately destroyed everything she claimed to value. Her legacy serves as an eternal warning that how we achieve power matters just as much as whether we achieve it, and that the methods we use to govern determine whether we will be remembered as builders or destroyers of human civilization. In the gentle quiet of this evening hour, as you prepare for peaceful rest, remember that the darkness Isabella cast over 16th century France was eventually overcome by leaders who chose light over shadow, healing over harm, and love over hatred. Her story, for all its tragedy and terror, ultimately affirms the human capacity to learn from our worst mistakes and to build something better from the ruins of our greatest failures. May your dreams tonight carry you to places where wisdom guides ambition, where moral courage tempers political skill, and where the shadows of the past serve only to illuminate the path toward a brighter future. The Shadow Queen's reign of terror has ended, but the lessons of her story continue to guide us toward better choices and kinder worlds. Sleep well, dear friend, knowing that even in history's darkest chapters, the possibility of redemption and renewal always remains, waiting for leaders with the courage to choose the light over the shadows that ambition can cast across the human heart. The story of Isabella de Medici is finished, but the greater story of human civilization continues, enriched by the wisdom that comes from understanding both our capacity for great evil and our endless potential for profound good. And so our tale concludes, as the last echoes of Isabella's troubled reign fade into the peaceful silence of historical memory, leaving us with the eternal truth that while power corrupts those who pursue it without moral constraint, it can also serve as a force for healing and hope when wielded by those who remember that true strength lies not in the ability to inspire fear, but in the wisdom to earn love, trust, and genuine respect from those we are privileged to serve. Rest now in peace, as France finally did when the Shadow Queen's long night ended and a new dawn of tolerance and hope began to shine across a kingdom that had learned, through suffering, the true meaning of civilized governance and moral leadership. The shadows have passed, the dawn has come, and all is well in the gentle realm of dreams that awaits your peaceful slumber.